my gosh. All right. So we're
Let's
live,
go.
apparently. I still don't see it, but if you see it, then we're good. Um,
Sorry for the technical difficulties, folks, but we are ready to go.
we are two people of a certain age, and as a result of as a result of our age, no, man, thank you, everybody, so much for tuning in to this really important conversation. This conversation is entitled "Shifting Narrative," right? Shifting narrative from graduation to liberation. Deep title, right? Like we
It is.
that's a heavy title. And we're going to talk about what that title means to us in a second, right? I have my awesome former colleague. I hate saying that, but first, friends, someone that I respect and admire, and really, just watching how Cecily moves in the ed space and as a mom is really just awesome to see. We're going to meet Cecily in a second. I'm Mike Andrews, my stage name, if you will, five Mikes, husband, father, educator, writer, MC, right? So those are the five Mikes. And I do a podcast and a series called Idea Manhood. This is kind of adjacent to that. This series is called Shifting Narrative, Graduation to Liberation. And we're entering this space talking about education. And, we're going to do our best today to talk about education from an appreciative point of view, right? We're going to talk about, we're going to do our best not to talk about education, especially educating Black folks, from a deficit point of view, right? Because that's what we're used to. That's what we know. We know how to talk achievement gap, like we know how to talk school to prison pipeline. We know how to talk pushing out Black girls. We know how to talk, graduation rates, dropout rates. We know all that. And we've heard that narrative before. And so we're really trying to shift the narrative to talk about like how education is more than just graduating and walking across the stage and your family yelling. Uh, for Black folks, it's a piece of the liberating tool. Again, Cecily, I want to give you an opportunity to introduce yourself, let folks know who you are, where you come from, and then we'll go from there.
Cool. Thanks, Mike.
Mhm.
Hi, everyone. I am Cecily Darden Adams. I've been in education my whole career, and whether it's on the career side or whether it's the mom side, my life revolves around kids, especially those kids that look like my own. Black and brown kids really matter to me at my core. So I'm a researcher. I'm that mom, as my kids say, and everything in between. I actually, Mike and I were joking, like I literally just kind of made my first Instagram post, and I had to really think about like, who am I? What am I? And so this is what I wrote there. So this might help describe me. I was like, mom of two dope dudes, education change maker, anti-racist, shoe aficionado, lover of all things brunch, data geek, coach, and nonprofit co-founder. I
Okay.
just co-founded Learning Pathmakers with my colleague Michael Robbins, and we are truly about to shift what we think about how we do education through a collaborative community building approach. So let's go, Mike.
That's awesome. And I can't wait to hear more about that. I know about it, but I can't wait for the folks to hear about what you and Michael Robbins are doing and how you're reimagining the space. All right, so shifting narratives, graduation to liberation. Off the top, what does that mean? What does that title mean to you, Cecily? Like, what is when you hear graduation to liberation? What does that mean?
Yeah, for me, you put the title out. We haven't talked about it yet, and I was like, "Ooh, that's rich," right? Because I come from these traditional settings where we talk about the goal in schooling is graduation. That's the goal, right? Um, we very rarely talk about the goal being learning. We very rarely talk about the goal being young people being able to live their own fulfilling lives, to be able to fulfill their own goals, to be able to really be their whole selves, to fill out their talents, their hopes, their dreams, their desires. And so really when you put that out there, I'm like, okay, graduation has been education's goal, but really what we need to be thinking about is liberation. And when I think of liberation in that sense, I'm thinking, you know, freedom, release of shackles, in the metaphorical sense, as well as the prison, the pipeline to prison, literal sense of, if you free minds, if you create minds that are ready to take a learning stance in, schoolwork and life, you have a space where people will be free, in the
Mm,
literal and metaphorical sense. So that's what hit me.
absolutely. All of that, all of that. And when I was thinking of this title, um, it COVID times really shined on me, right? I was thinking about our kids. We've had conversation about our boys and about my girl. We'll talk about our kids in a second. Um, and the reliance, the heavy reliance right now on, are our kids doing something? Like, are they, how are they doing in school? Like, right? Like, uh, do they have their laptops? Do they have internet connectivity? Um, that all of these technical things that we've been thinking and asking ourselves.
Hmm.
And the only thing I could think about is, what does that matter? In this point right now, what does it matter if a laptop, internet, like all of that just seems so small when you think about that people are dying and people are suffering, and the adults in our children's lives are having mental health breakdowns, and companies are having to apologize and write statements about Black people. Like, there's so much life being lived right now in the real world, right? Like, open your window, turn on the TV, right? Life is happening for our children, and our districts, our school settings, uh, seem to be micro focused on our kids learning virtually. Our kids, like, passing? Are they
I don't e-
making
I don't even
grade?
know if it's that, Mike. Like, it's there. The focus is on the same, thinking that somehow or another, if you put a Chromebook or a laptop and an internet connection over Zoom, that learning is going to be the same,
Yeah.
right? And
Yes.
it's,
Yeah.
there's just no way, first
Yeah.
of all, for it to be the same. But also what we prioritize. I mean, and what you just said really hit me, because the county I live in, on January 6th, they issued a statement and said, when we come back to school, we're going to be addressing this in social studies, et cetera, et cetera.
Hmm.
And so I asked my son, I was like, so, we spent the day talking about what was happening in my city. I'm a product of DC, and how he was digesting, this white supremacist insurrection that was happening in DC, and none of his teachers talked about it. They picked up just like they had been on January 5th, and continued on the lesson plan.
Hmm.
And he eventually let me know that his English teacher did bring it up, and so there's always like one, right, that's like, I'm just gonna buck the system.
I'm gonna go
I'm
off the rails,
do
right?
what I need to do for these babies, because this is what they need to do. This is the same teacher who set up an app to be able to be in communication with families. So
Hmm.
clearly she's doing something different.
Yeah.
But for them not to pause and say, we need to do this check on these children who are, within the DMV, who
Hmm.
are miles away from this happening,
Right.
and whose families might be literally within this zone, of what's happening was hard to digest. And it's just one example
Yeah. Yeah.
of the ways in which we keep trying to shove that square peg in this round hole of what we call schooling.
Yeah.
And we all know it has to be different. We
Yeah.
all know it.
Yeah. It definitely feels like a retrofit, right? Like the schools are trying to retrofit uh like what was happening on March 12th, 2000
Mm-hmm.
into, March 16th. They're just going to go back and we're going to be virtual. We're going to continue talking about algebra, and all of that in the grand scheme of things seems so small. So I will say, um I said start out, but I'm going to really say, oops, that's us. You hear us in the background. My bad.
Excuse the technical difficulties, y'all.
Tell me about your boys. Tell me about your boys. You don't have to use names if you don't want to, or their school district, whatever you feel like sharing. We're all amongst family and friends. So tell me about your boys.
Yeah, so I mean, I don't have boys. I still say boys, and I tell them you're gonna always be my boys. You're always gonna be my baby. But I have men on one side. So my oldest is 23 and just graduated in the middle of our pandemic from the Air Force Academy, and is
Awesome.
in headed to pilot training, right? Um, and when I say men, I put right with him my brother who is 5 months older, who and they grew up together like siblings
Wow.
their own selves. And he's 20, he will be 24 in a few weeks. And so like that was the first iteration of like parenting and sisterhood, really close. But then I also have a middle schooler, a 12-year-old who just started middle school in the
Mhm.
middle of all of this, who's never met his classmates in person,
Mhm.
and is in many ways, I'll say, not as bad as it was, but he was a chocolate drop in his French immersion classroom. And while there were other, brown kids, the other two that were brown were from families that weren't from this country. And so to have a Black American experience was something that was foreign to that in that environment. And so it meant a lot of conversations at home about what does this mean, how do you navigate this, some heartbreak on my part because I'm like, am I making the right choice sending my kid where he's kind of not not at home. But these are the choices that I think like a lot of parents are trying to figure out how to make. Like, what do I do to get what might be the best for my child, across a whole lot of different fronts.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I've heard you talk about your boys over the year, your men and boys, your boys to men over the years. And it's awesome what you're leading them to accomplish. The academy, any of them are a beast. So we already know that's really awesome. So let me tell you about my kids. So we're talking about our kids, just so you get a sense. I don't know if we said at the beginning, but Cecily and I, of course, are parents. Cecily and I are also educators in a time where, if you think about the time we're in right now, it's almost like education is a forgotten, it's like the most important and neglected aspect of this pandemic, right? Now, I'm not saying that there aren't millions of amazing teachers bending over backwards to do amazing things. But the same intensity that we talk about getting our bars open and our restaurants open and our gyms open, and the safety procedures that need to happen to make sure that folks go back to work and make money for the economy. I don't know if we've had that same intensity about our schools, and not necessarily just opening them, because I see a lot of people saying, open the schools. To do what? Like to do
There you go,
what?
Mike.
But we're going too deep. I'm going too deep. Let's dive back out. Let's
No,
dive back out.
I was going to say you can't leave it there though. I mean,
I jumped in. Now I'm diving back out. Right.
okay. Let me say two words though. I
Right.
mean, I think that it's important that we're asking it. One, schools have been open. Some of them might have shut
Facts.
down for a week or two,
Mm-hmm.
but they have been educating our kids since this pandemic started. So schools have been open.
Mm-hmm.
Educators have been like making all kinds of moves to try to make this work virtually in some spaces or hybrid in others. Um, but you're right. When we talk about going in person, going back to in person,
Mm-hmm.
this isn't like opening up a restaurant and saying, "Oh, well, I'm just going to take the next reservation." This is really how are we going to make sure that their well-being is okay, that young people are transitioning into socialization spaces that they haven't been. I mean, my since my oldest is away out of state, my little one is here with me. He has, socialization with other kids his age is minimal right
Mm-hmm.
now.
Mm-hmm.
And so how are we making sure that they're able to do that well and effectively? And that's something that
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. So that's why we're gonna go
we'll
there.
get there. Let's go. Let's go
Look,
back.
we are 20 minutes in. We're gonna go there. But my kids. So I have a ninth grader, ninth grade boy. My son is awesome. He is. I just came. My hands are still cold because we just came back from his first high school soccer game. He's playing on his high school soccer team. He just looks amazing, looked like a little young man out there. I was like, look at my boy, right? But he's doing in school, he's doing really well, right? And I even ask myself when people ask me how's he doing in school, I'm like, he's doing what he needs to do because I won't let it happen otherwise. But I don't even know what question are we asking when we like what answer do we expect to get when we ask that question?
Hmm.
Like he's doing like we're all doing. We're suffering with smiles on. We're getting by, right? we're we're all learning something. I'm going too deep, but he's a great student. He does what he needs to do. Courteous, kind, loves soccer, loves math. He took his first high school math course actually last year in eighth grade. Did okay with it. He took the second part of that this year. He got A his first semester in math. He's taking all honors courses, so he has a 4.2 some whatever. But
Some. He's
right,
doing a little
like
some.
he don't get no applause from me. Like that's what you're supposed to do, boy. Like no. Um, and my daughter is amazing. She's natural born leader. She is she's really taken to virtual learning the same way we've had to, right? Like humans are unbelievably flexible when we need to be, right? And I think our kids are following our lead. And so my daughter definitely is. I hear her on her Zoom calls, being a leader and telling kids to come off Zoom, come off
Come
camera,
on.
and turn their work in. So they're thriving. It's like they're thriving with the footnote, right?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
who's thriving right now? I'm philosophical question, but both of my kids are doing well. We're taking care of them, and being extra careful to this is where I want us to go next, Cecily. We, my wife and I, have really had to work hard to abandon, right? To separate ourselves from what educational success means right now.
Absolutely.
That's what keeps me awake at night, right? That,
So
like, literally, because I'm thinking about, you know, I grew up, my parents are West Indian. It was all A's. If you brought in a B, it's like, where's the A? Right. Like
mhm,
that's what
mhm.
we, Black folks in this country were taught. Like you got to be better than the best. And that means you get A's. And
Yeah.
so in this time where grades, I'm looking at the grades and I'm like, yeah, that's cool. But
But what does it mean?
what
What
does
does
it
it mean?
mean?
It
Right.
and it doesn't mean, and I think this is the thing that is so important for me is that not just in this moment, what does it mean? But it really has had me reflecting what has it meant,
Ever
right?
meant.
So
Right.
what has it really meant? And actually there was something that just came out that like Elon Musk was basically like, yeah, like my kids don't need to go to college, right? And so this question of like all of these traditional standards around the schooling system and what the benchmarks are we're supposed to hit in order to be considered successful as students, as people, as high school graduates, as college graduates. What does all of that mean? And does any of that represent your learning, how smart you are, how motivated you are? So I'm going to pull back because as you were talking about your son, um, I'm going to talk about last semester with mine, right?
Mm-hmm. Go
Or
in,
last
go in.
quarter, the first quarter of the school year.
Mm-hmm.
Um, he started like all in. He's like, this is middle school. I need a special ring light. I'm gonna be on. I have to have it all set up. He
Mm-hmm.
was ready to do this virtual. I think he was just like, just like if we were going in person, he'd want to go shopping for that fit and those shoes.
Mm-hmm.
He wanted all of his supplies laid out, and I was excited that he was excited. That's what got me excited. I wasn't excited about school per se. I was like, I'm not holding you to anything. Um, and I was like, so what'd you learn? So he's going through this semester. I could feel the excitement wane. You could feel like all
Mm-hmm.
the like all of the air went out of the
Right.
balloon.
And that happened to us too. It happened to the adults
Yes,
too, right?
exactly. And so I kept checking in, and I thought he was doing okay. And I looked, and at one point he had like, I don't even want to tell you what the actual grades were. There were just a whole lot of missing assignments.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And I was like, babe, what's going on? And so I don't know whether it was what happens in, excuse me, Mike, because this is gonna sound really gendered. I don't know
Oh,
if it was typical middle school boy stuff
we gotta have
where
another
y'all
conversation about that one. Like that's a whole
you
different
would find papers in the bottom of any middle school boy's backpack.
from 1973. Like how'd this paper get in
And
here?
you're like,
Like
babe, you did the work. Why didn't you turn it in? Um, or if it was related to the pandemic. I didn't know what was what, but I knew that for some reason he had pulled back. And then we had parent teacher conferences. And
mm-hmm.
it was like we were only allowed to meet with 3 teachers. And each of those meetings was limited to 8 minutes total. And everyone didn't start exactly on the minute. So you only
Right.
ended up with about 6 minutes with a teacher that you'd never met. And let's talk, like, we know that's not like that's just set up
Right.
for failure,
Right.
right?
Right. Right.
But I was able to get, by the second one, I kind of had a sense of like, okay, can you tell me how my kid is showing up and what you're interpreting from that?
That's a wonderful question. Right.
And I started to hear, oh, well, he doesn't always have his camera on. Oh, he's not engaged. Oh, and then I started to hear like they didn't think he was that smart.
Mm-hmm. See, we going in. We're going there. Okay, go
We're
ahead.
going there
Mm-hmm.
because I'm
Mm-hmm.
like, oh, is that because he's this little brown boy with the twists, because he thinks he's cool,
Right.
and he's sitting there with his Beats headphones on. Is that what you think, he's not engaged or smart or has the potential? And no one would say that,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
But the conversation that I did, that sat down with my little one about, was like, I don't care what your grades are in this moment, and I'm not sure that I'll ever care what your grades are,
Mm.
but I know that those people don't see you.
Mm. Right.
I know that those 3 people that I talked to in no way could tell me who you were,
Mm.
and that's a problem. And not just your problem, it's their problem too.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
But
Absolutely.
you've got to do your part to show them who you are, and they have to be on their game as educators to understand who each and every one of their students is, whether it's over a screen or in person, and what they need to learn, what they need to be successful. And yeah, so his grades represented something really different this quarter.
Mm-hmm.
um and he was really excited about the grades, right? He's like,
Absolutely.
straight A's. I'm excited, he got pizza, you know.
Right.
But it's not the grades. It was very clear that by the end of this quarter, those teachers understood more of who he was and what he needed, what his interests were, and what his they really they really leaned into being a team around his learning.
Mm,
And I will also, I'm going to give credit where credit's due. His health teacher, who was a black male educator, the only one that
mm,
he connected with,
mhm.
um, seemed to be a really important force in that transition.
Mm. All right. That was a lot. That was a
That was a
lot.
lot.
There's so much. I want to take this time right now to shout out all of the teachers, right?
Absolutely.
Because teachers right now, you talk about people, like, oh, you're doing God's work. Okay, yeah, great. Teachers right now are doing, so, I've seen some teachers and heard about some of the jobs and the ingenuity and the creativity that teachers are using despite what the district constrains them to do, right? Like, even though they may not be able to do X, Y, and Z, they're still doing what they have to do. Now, something you said about your son gave me the chills because when we're talking about liberation, that access, that gate that you open for your son to be himself, or to give him the freedom to be himself on the camera, off the camera, you need to let the teachers know who you are, not what you know, not how smart you are, not, what kind of camera you have, if it's 4K, 2K, whatever. But that, to me, that was the light switch for me, right? Because I'm gonna tell you, I was married to those very traditional. I was retrofitting myself. I
Mhm.
can't just blame the districts and the teachers and whoever else. It was me, right? For our kids. And I was like, you got to put your camera on. Like, how they going to know if you paying attention or not? Like, so you see what I'm doing? Like, I'm putting the responsibility on my kids who are 14 and 8 to show adults,
Mhm.
like, just based on the camera, right? Like, just based on the camera alone. Like, that was my, like, you got to have your camera on. Now, we know why the camera is important and why it is more important in some spaces than the other. But I saw a lot of articles and I saw a lot of conversations online with teachers saying, your kid's not coming on, they in the bed, like making a lot of, like, having a lot of negative assumptions about students and about families. But what you did with your son was you gave him power. Like, in that moment, you said, and I'm sure it wasn't one moment, you probably had to do it over and over and over and over again, because that's
He's
how boys work.
he's 12.
Right? You probably had to do that for like 5 months in a row every day. But what you did with the consistency was you gave him the power to control his experience, not at the benefit of the teacher, but because it's his,
Mhm.
right? And that's the part, because I know people are going to say, I know Black folks are going to say, but we got to make the grade. If we don't make the grade, if we don't get straight A's, if we don't volunteer, if we don't put our hands up, then what are they going to think of us? So you see what I'm saying? You see the slight nuance, the difference in, like, what are they going to think of us, as opposed to, like, how are you going to think of them, and how are you
Mhm.
going to show them who you are? Like,
Yeah.
how did you, like, what gave you the pause in that moment to give your son the freedom to do that?
Um, I would say it's two big things. One, is that I literally was on burnout with this remote learning stance.
Mhm.
I I mean, I literally was like, I cannot hold him responsible in a punitive way, you know, for what something that I don't think matters, right? Um, I don't know that anything that they are actually covering in content right now is going to be retained for almost any of these children, okay? Because of the conditions, because of all of the things going on around them right now. What they're going to walk away from this moment with is a recall of how they got through it, and the people call them soft skills, people call them social emotional, all of the things, all the, you know, the core being things that it took for them and the people that support them to get through this moment. That's what's going to stick with them. It's not going to be that equation from algebra, right?
Mhm.
And so what I wanted to first make sure I did was say, I want you to come from this moment, through this moment whole. And for that, it meant I just need you to focus on what you need. And so we had lots of conversations, as you said, like we had lots of conversations. Um, and I'm like, your grades will reflect whatever later. That is so far out of like order of priority, it didn't matter.
Mhm.
The second thing though is, and you I mentioned I just started this nonprofit called Learning Pathmakers, is that I have fully been working to reframe and shift how we're talking and thinking about education, and what learning means, and how do we center not just learning, but educating and supporting, and center that around what children are saying they want and need in this moment, what families, what parents who are so closely tied to everything about school right now, families have never been as connected to what was happening in their children's education as to right now. How are
Mhm.
we getting that um into the solutions that we're coming up with? And
Mhm.
another core piece that we haven't really talked about a whole lot is there are these awesome community-based organizations, whether they're arts and culture, that they're out of school time, they are just neighborhood libraries and rec centers. All of these places are there and ready and are putting out all kinds of things to support kids and families in this moment. And that's the stuff that I want to prioritize,
Yeah.
right?
Mhm.
So I was like, I don't, did you do your homework? Okay. I don't, as long as the assignments eventually get in,
Yeah.
but what were you supposed to learn? All right, now let's go do, like, if it was a science thing, let's go test out that hypothesis somewhere. Let's
Mhm.
go do something.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's what we really focused on, was like, how do we, that those couple of hours I was commuting every day,
Mhm. Yeah.
how do we repurpose some of that time to
Yeah.
spend on actually learning things around the house, learning things in our community, learning things online? um and while my his school wasn't really tapped into creating that bridge yet,
Mhm.
how was I helping him to create this bridge between um what was happening in his life and what they were talking about he needed to, like,
Mm.
learn in the curriculum?
Right. And so I want to stop there for a second because you talked about if the schools aren't doing it. I want to talk about you're in the DMV area. You don't have to share what county you're in. I am not in the DMV area. I'm in North Carolina. I won't share what county I'm in, but I posted this conversation on that county's parent website. So they may all be watching. Hello. Uh,
Hey y'all.
um, hey, y'all. That's what they would say too.
That's why I say hey y'all.
Hey, y'all. But I want to, as like putting on, like turning your cap around. You had your parent hat on, so now turning it around and putting the educator hat on, right? um what were some of your takeaways as you were watching the counties operate, like the county school systems operate, the schools, but like how information how, you know, how they were moving from the top down to like how it impacted you and your family. Um,
So I mean,
yeah.
that shift, that turn that hat around is real for me because
Mhm.
I worked for almost 10 years in Prince George's County Public Schools in central office.
Mhm.
I understand, I understand the executive level decisions, and that's hard stuff.
Mhm.
We just gave kudos to the teachers. We also have to give kudos to everybody who's in education,
Yeah.
who is really, frontline workers on this stuff, and making sure that kids are surviving this moment.
Mhm.
Um, that said, I think that most school systems are big bureaucracies, right? They're huge. I mean, Prince George's County unto itself had 20,000 employees, right? That's bigger
Mhm.
than some cities, right?
Right. Right.
Um, and in moving a bureaucracy, let me say this: what we saw with the pandemic was education shifted almost overnight.
Mhm.
It's something that people said was impossible to do, right? Everyone said, the life cycle of a superintendent is on average 3 years. um, they say that it takes 5 years to really shift outcomes in schooling, and that like 10 years to do like real culture, sustainable culture change. Well, we saw everything shift within a matter of weeks.
Mhm.
um we know that it's shifted, but I don't think it's shifted so that it works for kids, families, even teachers, right?
Yeah.
I think that the systems, the big bureaucracies, just want to keep doing, they want to keep doing this, and they wanted to squeeze that square peg into the round hole.
Yeah.
And it didn't work. I mean, it's not working.
It's not
It's
working.
not working for people.
It's not. And I mean, if I had to center in on a frustration in the pandemic, and I'm talking about the whole pandemic, like
Right.
from the actual COVID disease and the death and all of the things that go around that to the vaccine to everything, right? I think the biggest disappointment has been watching the counties operate. I'm going to be very honest. And it's not because there aren't amazing people and smart people and strong educators and former teachers and principals that are in those county systems. I think, I don't know. And this is the part, honestly, that is the most frustrating in all of this is that from the very beginning, those of us that maybe have the luxury, it might be a luxury that we're like not teachers, like you and I, right? Like people like us, because we like are more systems thinkers, right? So we're able to kind of look back and see like, why, like why are y'all sending me 3 emails a day about one subject? Like why are you asking me to make a decision that is going to impact a whole semester of my child's education in 2 days? Like, how
This is a
dare,
decision whether to go back in person or not. Yeah.
right? Like, how are you asking me to make a decision about virtual learning in the spring and it's October 1st? What are you talking about?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so, like, those frustrations is for me as a parent, as an educator, and an educator, they hit me hard and I was really disappointed, and I started going out there and I was emailing the communications person in the county where I live like, yo, what are y'all doing? Like, there's I can't sugarcoat this. And how they responded to me, I've been behind those emails on the other side, like
On the other
responding
side.
to angry people, right? Like,
Hmm.
oh, well, we're taking into consideration. Da, 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 da. And if you look in the paragraph on the third page of our website underneath 17 other pages, you will see that we put like that's how they were talking to me. And I was like, oh my God, they don't know what they're doing. Not in a bad way, not in an accusatory, like shame on you way, but in a strategic list, like there was just a lack
This might.
of like transparent strategic thinking.
Well, because Mike, so listen, we've been relying on systems to change education for our kids for a long time,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we like, education reform was supposed to do it. Like that was supposed to like be this secret sauce. If we just fired all of these black and brown teachers who have been teaching in neighborhoods forever and knew kids and families and
Mm-hmm.
probably lived in the neighborhood themselves, we get rid of them and bring in all of these new teachers from elsewhere who only are going to stay for 2 years, but it's okay, they went to Ivy League schools, so that's
Right.
what we're going to do. um Sorry y'all,
Exactly.
that's my rant.
I'm with you.
but
I'm with you.
but but that was one of the things that um we knew going into the pandemic was it was an experiment that didn't produce results. We knew that whether it was the over reliance on end of year standardized assessments, whether it was um, some of these talent strategies, that these were not where the solutions lie. We knew that ed reform was fit. Even those people that were ed reform adherents were like, all right, we got to find something new. um,
Mm-hmm.
Systems aren't The solutions are not going to come from within the system, though. They're going to come from you and me and other educators, like my youngest English teacher, who is like out the box just trying to do some things. It's going to come from the coaches that your son is playing with. It's
Mm-hmm.
going to come from uh, arts instructors. It's going to come from all of us who know these kids, who see their potential, who are going to come together and have solutions for them that
Mm-hmm.
really meet their needs,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And when I say solutions for them, that's a misspeak. That our young people themselves will be able to articulate, and then those of us around them will be able to support that, right?
Yeah.
I'm a Gallup strengths coach, so I believe in being able to say, what are my talents and how do I unlock that,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Absolutely.
You're never too young to start to figure that out. And it might change, but it's still fine. You want to figure that out. And then the big thing about Gallup is you got to be able to name it, claim it, and then aim it. And we got to be able to really support young people in being able to aim that, and having the people around them to do that as well.
Absolutely. Cecily, I want to take a couple minutes just to shout out to everybody that's watching.
Hey y'all.
I'm seeing your comments come in. Thank you for watching with us. I see Diana from Flamboyant. I see Michael Robbins is up here. I see Marilyn Bibbs Freeman, who is a friend from Marilyn Bibbs Freeman is the woman that I talked with. We had a conversation. She's an epidemiologist. We had a
Oh, that was your
conversation
first
about the
gifting narrative.
COVID vaccine. Yep, she's watching.
Mm-hmm.
And she brings up a point that I want to get your take on too. Can you believe I'm still in the district? Can you believe that my district sent me an email? This is I'm like, okay, y'all wilding now. They sent me an email asking, saying that if the kids for my oldest and my youngest for these end of year exams, for them to take them, they have to come into the school and set aside certain amount of time to take these end of year exams so they can see if North Carolina standards. I'm like,
This is one of the things
wow.
that has to, like, if there's something that needs to be having an immediate intervention, is that these seat time requirements need to be lifted for this moment, and and we need to revision what it looks like going forward, as well as all of these state requirements around standardized assessments. These are not producing the outcomes, especially for Black and brown kids, that we want to see anyway. So why in this moment, when everything else is upended, would we keep reverting back to that?
Right. So, so you want to invite the kids back to school to take an end of year exam in the middle of a pandemic when they've been virtual for about 12 months. Like, come on, man. Okay. Anyway, I'm sorry. I took a sidestep. One Marilyn, who I was just talking about, she made a point on the thread to say that there are solutions. Like, how do we incorporate the kids' voices too? Right? Like,
Yeah.
how do we ensure that our sons and our daughters, young and old, are invested in this because they are, I think, I think the biggest area of learning, like where our children are learning the most, they're watching us respond to the BS.
Yeah.
Like
I
they're
mean, and they're learning to be the level of autonomy that young people are developing in their own learning, the level of agency that they're
priceless.
developing in their own learning to be in how they are then able to translate those things into success in learning. I didn't say grades, but success in learning is where the power lies. I think that whatever solutions we come up with, and let me, I got to give this little pause and invite
Please,
people to the Learning Pathmakers
please do. Yeah.
expedition, because even though this is not set up this way, Marilyn's question is really this. We are having the Learning Pathmakers expedition starting on in 2 weeks, starting on February 16th. It's going to be 3 weeks of this kind of framing. We have really expert content that we're bringing forth around what has worked in remote learning. Even before we were in remote learning due to the pandemic, there was remote learning happening in places like District of Learning in DC. And what do we know from that we need to carry forward? And big part is how do we then have build community like this? It's not just me and you and the people in the chat, but that we are really in conversation and community around what are those solutions. um, we are going to do this over 7 live sessions in over 3 weeks for the expedition, where we're inviting learners, high school age students, teenagers and young adults, parents, families, teachers, community-based or educators, and out of school time folks, to really come and listen to learners. All of our calls to action in the expedition are coming from students, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's what we need to be hearing. We need to really stop, listen, and then come to solutions that are oriented to what we are hearing in this moment, not fitting that square peg in the round hole from before, because that's not where we're going to get the kind of success from young people we need.
Absolutely. I'm with you, and I'm doing everything I can to be a part of that those conversations. I really want to be about that because that's exactly where my mind is right now. I want to keep talking about this concept, or not even the concept, the reality of liberation, freedom.
Yeah.
Um, if anything, the last 12 months, 10 months have shown us is that um, everyone right now is hyper focused on Black folks, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like starting with Black folks. Like we are operating differently in the world now, right? Like do you feel that? You
Absolutely.
feel the difference, right? And you feel like the need and the necessity to organize and to something that we were talking about before we maybe when we were trying to go live the first
We were
time.
trying to get online.
But you talked about sharing stories, and I want to share something before we share a story before we talk about sharing stories. But so often we've talked about this a lot, Cecily, you and I. um, so often when we think about the stories of Black people, we think about pain, right? Like we think about struggle. Pain and struggle are almost interwoven into our existence, right? At least that's how it's presented. And that becomes the reality that Black people are here in this country because of the pain and the history of their past. I want to ask you, and ask us, I want us to have a conversation about like, how can we center Black joy? What does Black joy look like when we're talking about sharing our stories, when we're talking about freedom, when we're talking about education? Like, how are we shifting those narratives and we're centering, like, I don't want to cry no more. You know what I mean? Like figuratively and literally though, like I don't want our pain to be the center of our existence. I
Yeah.
just read an article in preparing for our conversation that like there are, of course, all studies and data that show that like white people aren't used to black people being happy.
Yep. That is a yes. I mean,
So
and
wait,
think
real
about
quick, hold on, Cecily. So think about this. We know the makeup of teachers. We know who are teaching our kids. We know who their bosses are, who are leading a majority of the schools our kids are in. If white people, loosely speaking and generally speaking, don't know what black joy looks like, then how are they looking at your son with his headphones on? And he might not be smiling. So, of course, maybe he's angry. I just want to talk to you because I have a concern. I saw your son and
Mhm.
he looked really sad today.
He looked
You know,
upset.
you know how many conversations I had like that? And I'm
Hmm.
like, what do you mean he looks sad? I don't understand. Because he wasn't smiling. He's sad because they don't know we could experience joy. Anyway, I'm not going to preach. But what do you think about that? Like, what are your feelings on that?
I mean,
I
I
didn't mean to
think
cut you off.
no, I think this is a great point that we should be, really digging in on. I mean, from a I'm gonna I'm turning my hat back to the educator side,
Uh-huh.
right? From the educator side, we are often, and I've been guilty of this, right? As a researcher, as somebody who does measurement on schools and education, is we're looking at the problem. Even how researchers frame research studies,
Mm-hmm.
it is rooted in a problem, right?
Mm-hmm.
When we think about how Black folks show up, whether it's history or literature in most school settings, it is about this struggle space. There's a presentation of Black people and their struggle to overcome, but not what you're talking about, meaning our successes and our joy and the ways in which um, we're just awesome. Right.
Right.
I mean, the
Absolutely.
whether you call it the Black girl magic or Black boy bling or whatever you want to call this, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
you've got to you've got to have a space where people are leaning into that um appreciative or affirmative or strengths based. There's all of these ways to think about it, but we almost never apply those things when we're talking about Black kids in school.
Mm-hmm.
And
Absolutely.
that's what I think that there is something really important for us to shift at the systemic level, but that's going to come from us. That's going to come from educators, parents, community coming together and saying this doesn't represent us, and our solutions have to lie in a space that represent us. um,
Absolutely.
but yeah, that space, the framing of joy, and we've talked about it on a personal level, you and me.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know that we've talked about it on like a systemic level. But just the fact that we are always framing in the problem. And I will say that this venture that I'm in with Learning Pathmakers is the first time in all of my years, I'm not going to tell you my age, but in all of my years in education, that I feel like we can be ahead of the problem
Mm.
instead of studying the problem and reacting to the problem. We're on the verge of having a solutions oriented approach that is positive, that is appreciative, that is strengths based. And that's where we'll see, that's where we'll have the chance to get to the space of Black joy
Mm.
in schooling and education, I think.
Absolutely. I think another point there, Cecily, that we also talked about before when we were preparing is that, there's a reason why I started a podcast, right? There's a reason why I opened up this shifting narrative thing, whatever this is, right? And it's because uh, there need to be more opportunities for Black people to share their stories, right?
Absolutely.
Like for Black people to show up as whole beings. So that means, yes, I will be angry and I will be happy and I'll be sad and I'll fall in love and I'll fall out. Like to show us as full human beings, right? So look at what we're asking for. Like it's just such the basic elements of humanity.
Hmm.
And I feel like the work that educators are doing is human work. We're not doing education. We have the pressure and the burden and the desire and the need to teach our kids to be human
Yeah.
and to show up in the world as whole, right? Like I used to work with boys in the city in DC, and the one thing that when they were in our space, like we were in the schools, like we'd be at Dunbar High School, Spin Gone when it was open, like
Yeah.
we were in the schools, like the schools, right?
Hmm.
And I would show up in there with my tie on because I was working with the system and that's what I had to wear, right? And but when the boys were in our space, the only thing we told them they didn't have to do is they didn't have to change how they normally operate.
Yeah.
So if they came into our space and they felt like cursing, they could curse. If they came in wearing a hat, they could wear a hat. If they wore their pants sagging at the time, you could do that. Now, there were people that looked at us as the program designers like crazy, like these boys have to have respect. They had to be a certain way, da 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 da. But all we were doing is establishing trust
Yes.
and saying
There
that
you go.
you are okay however you show up into this space. Like I can't ask you to share anything about me if the first thing I'm concerned about is take your hat off in this building. You know
Hmm.
what I'm saying? So what is uh the importance of Black stories, and how do we create the space for you to share yours, me to share mine, folks in different corners of the world to share their unique Black stories?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a great question, a great point. You hit a word that has been at the forefront for me, which is just humanity, and it's a hard thing to say that that's what we're asking for,
Mm-hmm.
is to be seen in our whole humanity. But it's a really important thing to lay as foundational, that you will not see me as a flat object, that you'll see deeper than what you see on the surface.
Mm-hmm.
But what that means for me though is, personally, I'm gonna go like personal,
Mm-hmm.
is like I've been a researcher my whole career, my whole professional life, and it just hit for me that I am not used to telling my story publicly. I mean, even in talking about my kids, I don't talk about my kids, I talk about kids,
Mm,
right? Talk about, like, as a researcher, you're telling someone else's data, you're talking about the system or the school or this. I am feel super compelled in this moment to tie my personal narrative, my personal story, my personal journey
mm,
to all of these other, um, whether it's data or stories or narratives, and to hold space for others to tell theirs. And I don't mean tell it in a way that's objectifying, right? Because that happens too, where we
absolutely.
that performative pain, or that, all of these ways in which we ask, Black and brown folks to show up and tell their story, and that's not tied to the shifts in culture or policy that we need to see.
Mm,
That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm
mhm,
talking about is really, um, shifting power so that those stories are the source
mm,
for what comes next.
mm.
And I, I don't have a big voice. Y'all know I just joined social media, really. but
Welcome to the fray.
but really, this is the time you hear it a lot. I've been hearing a lot of Black voices speak up.
Yeah.
But this is a time to really tell the richness of our experience and bring forth the level of humanity that will I think be foundational for the changes that you and I want to see. And I know there's a critical mass. I
Yeah.
know there's enough of us that want to see this,
Yeah.
that when we come together, and that's what we're doing with Learning Pathmakers, is creating that space to come together.
Mm,
When we come together, there won't be a choice but to do something, to do this radically different in this revolutionary space of how we encounter education.
yeah.
There won't be a choice.
Yeah. Agreed. Agreed. We've been on for about an hour. I want to keep it true to our time. I feel like we could do this like
We could
for
talk forever.
3 hours. Like we could shut it down. I want us to have like like parting words almost. Like if you don't mind, I'm putting you on the spot, but I know you're good for it. But I'll start off. I'll give you some time to this. I freestyle a lot. I don't write anything down.
I,
I'm the
I
I'm the
worked with you, remember?
I'm the Jay-Z of podcasting. I don't write nothing down. No, in all seriousness, no. Like this is to me what you talked about, Cecily, in terms of like the power of right now. I think we've heard Obama talk about like the importance and the intensity and the power of right now is that I am adamant about creating spaces for Black people to share their stories, um, and tie our own individual stories to what's happening around us. I
Mhm.
think that that is the liberation gateway for our children. I think that this moment, this pandemic of 2020, 2021, 2022, is going to be like an opportunity for our children to become storytellers and our children to free themselves from the box of perfection, right? Like we had to I talk a lot of stuff about my mom is amazing, but like she always made me take my school pictures in shirt and tie, right? She gets mad when I talk about it, but and I understand why,
Yep.
because there was an image that we had to portray as Black people, as poor Black people, West Indian in Brooklyn, New York. Like we had to look in a certain way, our hair had to be a certain way, right? And there's a space for that. That's one story. That's
Hmm.
half of a story, right? But imagine the liberation and the freedom that our kids, that your son and my son could show up with his dreadlocks, or it could show up with his fade and waves, or could show up with the hat on, or like those things don't matter. They don't paint a picture or paint a narrative of who our boys are, who our girls are,
Yep.
that they can have the ownership of their experience through their story. That mom and dad, auntie, uncle, grandma are not going to tell your story. You are,
Yep.
right? And that's how you're going to make the A, whatever the A is for you. It might be an A in a report card. It might be an internship. It might be I'm gonna go be a graffiti artist. I'm gonna do something powerful for my people, whatever it is. And so that's the word I want to leave with folks. And this is for parents, for educators, especially parents and educators of Black folks, is like create the space for young people to share their stories in their own verses, in their own voice, without a lot of structure. Just let them talk,
Yeah.
and look for the learning opportunities, look for the learning pathways, right? Like
Mhm.
that's
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
what we all need to be working towards. So I'm gonna let Cecily end it, and then we'll be peaced out.
Okay. Um, I think my closing space, it actually extends on what you just said. That being able to have the just the power to tell your story, the people around you to support you and being able to tell that story, and to be able to own it, like to really own it, right? Is essential. These All of these pieces are really tied to what we've been talking about in terms of like equity. We've been talking about like equity in education, and that has gotten so watered down and so muddled. One of the things that Michael and I in forming Learning Pathmakers wanted to start with our values. And I think that closing this out, I want to end on like justice as one of our core values.
Mm,
And the way that we frame justice
mm,
is um, equity is kind of it's a state that you're constantly working at. There's no equity goal. There's no end in equity, right? You're
yeah.
constantly there's no end point. Justice is the end point.
Mm,
When young people, the people that support them, the people that educate them can all come together in this space where justice, educational justice for them, where all of those things that you talked about, Mike, already are there, that's when we'll see a true change, a true revolution in what
mm.
education means for us in this country.
Perfect way to end that. Cecily, thank you so much for your time, for your perspective, for sharing your story, for talking about your boys. I feel like we might need to do. I have a part two with Marilyn coming up. I think we need to do a part two where we talk about these boys, the young men you've raised,
Yeah.
the young boy you're raising, the boy I have in my house here. Um, because there's quite an opportunity for them right now in this space too that we have to talk about that.
Let's definitely come back. I'm a boy mom, so let's go.
Hardcore. All right, everybody. Thank you for tuning in. I'm gonna zoom the. I'm zooming it right now. I'm gonna YouTube this, and I'll have the audio on my podcast. I'll have the video on YouTube in a couple days whenever I get my tech skills up to do it. Um, but yeah, thank you all for watching, and we'll see y'all next time. Cecily, stay on. I'm just gonna stop the
Thank,
live, and then we'll.
okay. Bye
All
everybody.
right. All right. Wait. I think. Wait.